The birth of the United States. The growing anger. The new king. In retrospect, we see that the British might have handled matters more wisely. If the Americans had been allowed to rule themselves to a certain extent, and if the more influential Americans had been allowed a share of the profits, the Americans might of their own accord have turned over more money to the British than Great Britain could have gained through coercion. Added to the circumstances contributing to the British failure to see this, was the sheer chance that a new king had ascended the throne, one who, by ill fortune, was precisely unsuited to the times. On October 25, 1760, the British king, George II, had died after a reign of 33 years, during which British dominions overseas had expanded greatly. Indeed, it is from this reign that one can truly speak of the British Empire. His son, Frederick, who had been the heir to the throne, had died in 1751. It was Frederick's son, who was 22 years old at the time of his grandfather's death, who succeeded as George III. The new king was not very bright. He had not learned to read till he was 11, and, late in life, he was to go mad. He never really had self-confidence in himself, and, as sometimes happens, this was translated into obstinacy. He could never bear to admit he was wrong, so that he persisted on his own way long after it was clear to everyone else that what he was doing was producing the very reverse of the results he wanted. George III was no tyrant. He was a moral man who loved his family and who lived a perfectly respectable life with his wife and children. He was even lovable in some ways, and was certainly a much better human being than the two Georges who preceded him had been. He lived, however, at a time when elsewhere in Europe, kings were absolute. That is, King Louis XV of France, who had been ruling nearly half a century at the time that George III succeeded to the throne, did as he liked. He had no parliament to interfere with him, no prime minister to run the country without control, no elections to decide policy, no parties to squabble with one another, no politicians free to attack the king. It was humiliating to George that he alone of all European monarchs was controlled and hounded by the landowning squires who dominated the parliament. His great-grandfather, George I, and his grandfather, George II, hadn't cared. They had been German-born, and had ruled over the German land of Hanover. They had been far more interested in Hanover than in Great Britain, and were perfectly willing to let the British Prime Minister rule as he pleased. The first two Georges had, in fact, scarcely been able to speak English. George III, however, felt differently. Though still ruler of Hanover, he was English-born and English-bred. He spoke English and felt English, and he had an intense desire to govern Great Britain. During his teens, when he was heir to the throne, his widowed mother, whom he idolized, constantly urged him to take over the duties and powers that had once been part of the crown. Be a king, she had told her son, meaning a king after the fashion of the absolute monarchs elsewhere in Europe. George III did try to be a king. He could not actually abolish the powers of Parliament and make himself into an absolute monarch. Had he tried this, he would surely have been overthrown at once by a nation which had long since settled down to strictly limited royal powers. What he did then was to try to govern through Parliament by choosing those politicians who would be on his side and who would labor on his behalf. In this way, he did his best to place Parliament under his control. He disliked William Pitt, for instance. Pitt, the minister who had taken over the direction of British policy in the dark years when the French seemed on the point of gaining victory, and who had led Great Britain to recovery and triumph, was the very epitome of what George III detested. Pitt was a powerful and resolute politician who behaved as though he were king. After George III had been king for a year, he found means to force Pitt's resignation in October 1761. It was safe to do that, of course, since Britain's victory was by that time secure. With Pitt gone, the Treaty of Paris in 1763 reflected a kind of glory on George III. He was on the throne at the top and bore the credit of victory, even though it had been clinched before he had become king. It was in the American colonies that George III could most nearly succeed in his ambition to be a king. In the colonies, there was no parliament to dispute control with him. There, at least, he could rule at his pleasure, appointing and discharging officials, setting policy, and clamping down on offenders. There were colonial legislatures, to be sure, but on the whole they had little power against the king. George III did not exert his power in the colonies in any evil way, for he was not an evil man. The American complaint was that he could do it at all, whether for good or evil, without consulting the Americans themselves. The clashes began almost as soon as George III was on the throne, and they were over the matter of smuggling. Smuggling was always an evil in British eyes, but during the French and Indian War, it had seemed absolutely insupportable. At least some of the illegal American trade was with the enemy, and it went to support the French and contribute to the deaths of British soldiers, and of American soldiers too. The British felt quite justified in making special efforts to put a halt to smuggling and to enforce the laws that Parliament had passed regulating American trade and commerce. This had been decided on by Pitt in 1760, about the time George III had come to the throne, and in this case, George III agreed with Pitt. Enforcing the trade laws over a large, thinly populated land 3,000 miles away, where the population generally was not willing to see them enforced, was easier planned than accomplished, however. Searching for smuggled goods and trying, once they were found, to prove them to have been smuggled was almost impossible without cooperation from the people on the spot. For that reason, the British government decided to issue writs of assistance. These were generalized search warrants. A customs official, possessing a writ of assistance, had the right to enter any building to search for goods. There was no need to specify the particular building or the nature of the goods being searched for. Such writs of assistance were not a new thing. They had been issued as early as 1751. In 1761, however, when the new writs were issued, the Americans no longer feared the French and no longer felt dependence on British military help. They were more conscious of their rights and more ready to insist upon them. The right and wrong of smuggling, and who could honestly condone trading with the enemy, was not at issue. The question was whether such writs of assistance were legal. Such generalized search warrants were illegal in Great Britain, where it was an established axiom of the law that a man's house is his castle. No matter how humble or ramshackle a man's house might be, it could not be entered by the king or by his representatives without due process of law involving a specific house for a specified purpose. Why, then, was a man's house not his castle in the colonies? In Massachusetts particularly, where smuggling was rampant, there was enormous opposition, and the legality of the writs was called into question. On February 24, 1761, the case for and against the writs was argued in Massachusetts superior courts. Against the writs uprose James Otis, born in West Barnstable, Massachusetts, on February 5, 1725. The son of one of the most respected judges in the colony. His argument, pleaded most eloquently, was that the rights possessed by Englishmen, in consequence of natural law, could not be violated either by decree of the king or by act of Parliament. There was a basic constitution which, even if unwritten, embodied these natural rights, and an act against the constitution, he said, is void. In effect, Otis held that the British government in issuing writs of assistance was itself subversive, and that Americans in refusing to obey this particular law were, in so doing, upholding the basic principles of law. He was preaching what we today call civil disobedience. The British were not affected by this argument and continued their policy of issuing writs of assistance. To many Americans, however, Otis had raised a beacon of light that was to guide them onward and to justify them in rebelling against British law in the name of a higher law. A similar event took place in Virginia somewhat later. In Virginia, it had been the custom, since 1662, to pay clergymen in tobacco. Hard money was scarce, and tobacco was a valuable commodity. The trouble was that the value of tobacco fluctuated. Though its price was generally 2 pence a pound, there came a series of bad years in which the tobacco harvest was poor because of drought, and the price went to 6 pence a pound. This meant that if the clergy received their customary allotment of tobacco, £17,000 a year, their salaries would be, in effect, tripled. The Virginia legislature, the House of Burgesses, which was controlled by tobacco planters, abandoned the tobacco payment in 1755 and established a money payment instead at the rate of 2 pence a pound. To this, the clergy, of course, objected and took their case to the British government. On August 10, 1759, while George II was still king, the British government annulled the Virginia law and restored payment in tobacco. The Virginians ignored the British ruling, and finally, a particular clergyman brought the matter up before the Virginia courts toward the end of 1763. The case was called the Parsons Cause. Arguing against the clergyman and for the law as passed by the House of Burgesses was Patrick Henry, born in Hanover County, Virginia, on May 29, 1736, the son of a Scottish immigrant. He had had little schooling and could not make his way either as a storekeeper or as a farmer. It was not until he tried the law that he found his bent, for he proved to be a remarkable orator. In his speech against the clergyman's case, delivered on December 1, 1763, Henry did not concern himself with whether the law as passed by the House of Burgesses was wise or foolish, humane or cruel. The question at issue was whether the British government could, at its own will, cancel a law passed by the House of Burgesses. Henry argued that it could not, that again, the natural law was violated by this arbitrary British action, and that therefore, that action was without force. The jury was sufficiently moved by Henry's eloquence to award the clergyman just 1 penny in damages. The notion of a natural law was an attractive one to the intellectuals of the time. 100 years before, the great English scientist Isaac Newton had worked out the laws of motion and of universal gravitation, and had shown how the workings of the universe could be expressed in these laws, which could be simply stated and clearly interpreted. There followed all the enthusiasm of the so-called Age of Reason, in which many felt, over-optimistically, that everything in the universe could be reduced to laws that were as general, as powerful, and as simply phrased as Newton's law. There were even such laws governing society, some felt, that were as natural and as inevitable as the laws of motion, and as essentially unbreakable by governments. The most outspoken and eloquent of those who believed in this natural law of society was a French-Swiss writer named Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was extraordinarily influential in his own time among the intellectuals of Europe and America. In 1762, he published his book, The Social Contract, in which he maintained that governments were instituted with the consent of the governed in order to bring about certain desirable ends more efficiently than could be brought about without government. Whenever a government proved, for any reason, incapable of bringing about those desirable ends, or was not desirous of doing so, it had broken its contract. It was then the right of the governed to reorganize or replace the government. It was this sort of thing which men like Otis and Henry had in mind, but the British king and his parliament, quite oblivious to Rousseau's doctrines, went their own way.